I found a legendary starship at auction, but they were about to scrap it for good. The auctioneer skipped lot 7,441, so fast that I almost missed it. I had been standing at the back of the viewing deck for 3 hours, sweating through a pressure suit that was 2 sizes too small, watching alien merchants outbid each other for ship parts I could not afford. The station smelled like coolant fluid and old metal, and the gravity was set about 15% lower than what my body was used to, which meant every time I shifted my weight, I felt slightly too light, slightly too wrong, like the floor might stop caring about me at any moment. Orin 9 was not built for humans. Nothing about it suggested that any human had ever been welcomed there, or even seriously considered. The corridors were too wide and too low. The lighting ran in a spectrum that hit my eyes like a mild headache. The translated announcements had a half-second delay that made every sentence feel like it was arriving from somewhere far away. I was there because I had a permit, a translator chip, and a list of 12 salvageable components that I needed to turn a profit on before the end of the month. That was the entire plan. Find the components, bid low, win cheap, resell to the 3 repair yards that had already told me they were interested. Clean, simple, practical. The plan did not survive contact with lot 7,441. I heard the number and looked up from my datapad. The auctioneer, a tall Queln with pale membranous skin and 4 arms folded in the way their species indicated boredom, was already moving to the next entry. On the display screen behind him, the image cycled for exactly 4 seconds before changing. 4 seconds was enough. I saw the hull markings. Old ones, human ones, half burned away by something that had gotten very close a very long time ago. But enough remained. Enough of the angular script, enough of the faded designation numbers, enough of the specific damage pattern along the forward port section that matched the historical images I had studied as a kid, sneaking into my uncle's restricted archive files. "Wait," I said. Nobody heard me. I was a human at an alien auction yard. My voice did not carry weight in that room. I pushed forward through the crowd. The Vreth merchant on my left made a clicking sound of irritation and shifted 2 of its 8 limbs to block me. I went around it. The Queln archivist on my right did not move, but its narrow eyes tracked me with the specific expression I had learned to read as mild contempt mixed with professional curiosity. "Wait," I said again, louder this time. "Hold lot 7,441. The auctioneer stopped. Not because my voice commanded authority. I think it stopped because a human speaking up at one of these auctions was unusual enough to qualify as entertainment. It looked at me with 3 of its 4 eyes. "The human wishes to view the lot?" it asked, through the translation system. "The human wishes to bid on the lot," I said. There was a pause. Around me, the room made various sounds that my translator chip rendered as amusement, dismissal, and one sound it could not translate at all, which I suspected was closer to pity. "The lot is designated for materials processing," the auctioneer said. "It has no recorded buyer interest. The components are below standard resale value. The vessel is registered as non-operational, non-restorable, and non-viable for any purpose other than raw material extraction." "I understand," I said. "It is a scrap listing," the auctioneer said, with the particular emphasis of someone who wants to make absolutely sure the other person understands they are about to waste their time. "I understand that too," I said. "What is the opening bid?" Another pause. 40 credits. I looked at my account balance on my datapad. I had 412 credits to my name. After this auction, I had a 600 credit fuel debt coming due in 9 days, and a parts order that required at least 300 credits in upfront material costs. "I bid 40 credits, I said. The room made that sound again, the one that needed no translation. Nobody bid against me. Why would they? The lot was junk. The lot was always going to be junk, to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. The hammer came down. The translator chip rendered the auctioneer's closing statement as, "Lot 7,441, sold. Human buyer. Materials processing waiver attached. Vessel must be vacated from station docking by end of cycle." I paid. I collected the transfer documentation with shaking hands. I walked back through the crowd, and nobody looked at me, because as far as everyone in that room was concerned, I had just spent 40 credits to buy myself a very large, very expensive problem. They were not entirely wrong. The mag tether pulled the ship into Auxiliary Dock 7, while I stood at the observation window and looked at her. Really looked at her. She was large, much larger than I had expected from the display image. She had been a warship once, not a patrol craft or a light escort, but a genuine warship, built for extended combat operations at range, built for the kind of engagement where you expected to take damage and needed to survive it anyway. She had taken damage. That much was obvious. The forward port section had a long, curving scar that ran from the secondary shield emitter down to the lower hull plating, a wound so old that the metal around it had oxidized into a dark reddish color that looked almost like dried blood on pale skin. 2 of her 4 engine pods were completely gone. Not damaged, gone. Removed at some point by someone who needed the parts and did not consider the source. The communications array was a ruin. The hull plating in 3 sections had been replaced with what looked like salvage material from at least 2 different ship classes, patches applied over worse damage beneath. But she was still there. 200 years after the last record of her position, she was still there. And the hull markings, the ones that had survived every repair and every patch, and every hand that had tried to strip her down to nothing, still read what they had always read. Lot 7441, ISV Unconquered. I had read about the Siege of Caldera when I was 11 years old, in a file my uncle kept on a private drive that he thought no one else knew about. It was not in the approved curriculum. A lot of the early war history was not in the approved curriculum because the Galactic Consortium, which now oversaw most of human space, preferred a version of history that emphasized cooperation and integration rather than the specific, ugly, desperate years before humanity had been invited to join anything. But the file existed, and I had read it, and I had read it again, and I had read it a 3rd time because it was the kind of story that does not let you go easily. The Siege of Caldera lasted 11 days. At the start of those 11 days, there had been 14 ships in the defensive line. By the end of the 2nd day, there had been 3. By the end of the 5th day, there had been 1. The ISV Unconquered held the Caldera Gate alone for 6 more days. Alone. Against an opposing force that by the end was sending ships in, specifically to deal with 1 human warship that refused to stop being a problem. The crew of 412 people kept her running, kept her fighting, kept her in position across 6 days of continuous engagement, long enough for the reinforcement fleet to arrive, and long enough for the colonies behind the gate to evacuate. The final recorded communication from the Unconquered, sent on day 11, was 3 words. The colonies are clear. After that, nothing. The official record listed her as destroyed in action with all hands. The Consortium Historical Database, which I had checked twice before coming to this auction, had no record of her at all. As far as the galaxy's institutional memory was concerned, she did not exist. But she was in Auxiliary Dock 7, and I had the transfer documentation in my hand. I put on my suit, and I went in through the airlock. The interior was dark. Not completely dark, because there were emergency strips in the corridor walls that still glowed a dim amber, but dark enough that I had to use my helmet light, and dark enough that the edges of things appeared and disappeared in the beam like something learning how to exist again. The air was stale but breathable, the life support running on whatever reserve system had kept it ticking over for 2 centuries without anyone asking it to. The walls were covered in marks, not graffiti, not damage, but the specific accumulated record of a ship that had been used very hard by people who cared very much about what they were doing. Handwritten notes next to panel access points, modification records scratched into the metal beside junction boxes, names, in some places, just names, written in the particular way that people write names when they want to make sure the names are not forgotten. I walked through the ship for 40 minutes before I found the command core. It was located 3 levels below the main bridge, behind a reinforced door that took my emergency override tool 4 attempts to convince. When it finally opened, the smell that came out was different from the rest of the ship, cooler and cleaner, like the room had been sealed more completely than anything around it. The command core was small. It was designed to be small, to be the part of the ship that could keep operating even if everything else stopped. The main console was dark. The secondary console was dark. But in the far corner, Mounted in a housing that had clearly been installed as an addition rather than an original fitting, a crystal stack about the size of my forearm was glowing with a faint, steady blue light. I walked toward it slowly. The blue light brightened. "Human life sign detected," said a voice, from speakers I could not see. "Initiating contact protocol. Please identify yourself and your unit designation." The voice was calm and clear and completely awake, as if it had been waiting for exactly this conversation for no time at all, rather than 200 years. My heart was doing something complicated in my chest. I stood very still and I said, "My name is Davin Marsh. I am a salvage operator. I purchased this vessel approximately 2 hours ago from the Orin 9 auction facility." A pause. "Purchased," the voice repeated. "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "What is the current status of the 14th Fleet?" I had thought, on the walk to the command core, about what I would say if the ship's system was still active. I had thought about it in the practical way, the way you think about problems you need to manage. The 14th Fleet, the reinforcement fleet that had arrived at Caldera on day 11. I had thought about how to say it. There was no good way to say it. "The 14th Fleet was decommissioned," I said. "The war ended. Humanity won." That was approximately 200 years ago. The blue light in the crystal stack pulsed once, very gently. 200 years, the voice said. "Yes." "And the enemy?" I understood what it was asking. Not where the enemy was. Not whether the enemy had regrouped or changed their approach or continued operations somewhere else. It was asking the only question that mattered to a ship that had spent 6 days holding a gate alone. "The conflict is over," I said. "The colonies behind Caldera Gate survived. The people you were protecting are still there. Their descendants are still there." The blue light steadied. "Then we held long enough," the voice said. It was a simple sentence. 4 words. I had heard simpler sentences in my life, sentences with fewer syllables and shorter words. But there was something in those 4 words that landed in my chest like a physical weight, and I stood in the dark command core of a ship that should not have existed anymore, and felt the full meaning of them settle into me. "Yes," I said, when I trusted my voice again. "You held long enough." "I am the Archon system," the voice said. "Autonomous Response and Command Hub, for ongoing navigation. I am the command intelligence of the ISV Unconquered. I have been in reduced operational state for what my internal chronometer indicates is 197 years, 4 months, and approximately 11 days. "That sounds accurate," I said. "I was not destroyed," Archon said. It was not a question, but it had the sound of something being checked against an expectation. "No," I said. "Apparently not. I lost primary power during the engagement. The core housing went into emergency preservation mode. I was not aware of the intervening time. I was not aware of anything." A brief pause. "It is a significant gap. I imagine so." "Mr. Marsh," Archon said, "you stated that you purchased this vessel." "I did." "From an auction?" "Yes." This vessel was at an auction. "It was listed as materials processing stock," I said carefully. "They were going to break it down for raw metal." The blue light in the crystal stack did something I could not quite describe. It did not flicker, and it did not dim, but there was a change in the quality of it, a brief shift that felt like watching someone absorb difficult news and decide what to do with it. "I see," Archon said. "I recognized the hull markings," I said. "I know what this ship is. I know what you did at Caldera. I know what the crew did." "The crew," Archon said. The 2 words came out with a weight that told me everything about what it had been carrying alone in the dark for 197 years. "I am sorry," I said. "I do not have records of individual survivors. The official accounts were incomplete. But the histories that do exist are clear that the crew of the Unconquered held the gate. They are remembered." "By whom?" "By humans," I said. "By anyone who looks for the real history rather than the comfortable version." Another long pause. "And you?" Archon asked. "Why were you at the auction?" "I came for engine components," I said. "I needed them to resell at a profit. I had a list." "And instead you purchased me." "And instead, I purchased you," I confirmed. "For 40 credits," Archon said. Its tone was perfectly neutral in the way that certain kinds of irony do not need any inflection at all. "It was the opening bid," I said. "Nobody competed. They did not know what they were looking at." "No. But you did." "Yes." The blue light of the crystal stack pulsed again, slower this time, in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. "Mr. Marsh," Archon said, "this vessel is in significant disrepair. 2 engine pods are absent. Primary weapon systems are non-functional. Communications array is destroyed. Hull integrity is at approximately 61%. Life support is running on a secondary reserve system that was rated for a maximum of 3 years of continuous operation." "I know," I said. "I can provide a complete damage assessment if you require it." "That would help," I said. "But first, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The crew," I said. "Do you have records? Names, service records, personal logs, anything?" The pause, before Archon answered, was the longest yet. Long enough that I wondered if I had asked the wrong question, or asked it in the wrong way, or touched something that the intelligence inside the crystal stack had been protecting for a very long time. "Yes," Archon said finally. "I have complete crew records for the final complement of 409 personnel. I have their service files, their personal logs where they chose to make such recordings, the communications they sent during the 11 days of the siege, and the final orders and statements of the command staff." "You have been holding all of that for 200 years, I said. "I had no one to give it to," Archon said. "I preserved everything I could, everything that was not destroyed in the engagement. I kept it, because it seemed important that it should exist somewhere, that someone should have it, even if there was no one to receive it." I sat down on the floor of the command core because my legs had decided they needed a moment. "Archon," I said, "I am not a historian, and I am not a military officer, and I do not have the resources to restore this ship properly. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you deserve honesty." "I appreciate that," Archon said. "But I am going to try," I said. "I do not know exactly how yet, but I am not leaving this ship in a salvage yard, and I am not letting anyone strip it down, whatever it takes." The blue light in the crystal stack held steady, bright and clear, for a long moment. "Mr. Marsh," Archon said, "I have 1 operational engine pod, a partially functional shield system, and enough stored power to maintain basic functions for approximately 14 months. I also have 2 centuries of observations about human stubbornness from the period before my dormancy." Another pause. "I believe you." I laughed. It came out louder than I expected in the quiet of the command core, echoing off the sealed walls. "Good," I said. "Then let us figure out where to start." I did not know, sitting on that floor in the dark, that the next 6 months would cost me more than I had ever lost, demand more than I had ever given, and change more than I had thought could be changed. I did not know about the consortium enforcement cutter that was already running a registration check on my new acquisition. I did not know about the Queln archivist who would decide that Archon was too valuable to be left in the possession of a low-credit human salvage operator. I did not know any of that. What I knew was that I was sitting in the command core of the ISV Unconquered, talking to a 200-year-old warship intelligence that had held a gate alone for 6 days and come through it still intact, still running, still carrying the names of 409 people it had not been able to save but had never stopped protecting. And I knew that nobody was breaking this ship down for parts, not while I had anything to say about it. Outside, through the hull plating and the sealed door and the long corridors of the auxiliary dock, the auction continued. Lots were called. Credits changed hands. Ships and components and pieces of things that had once been whole were assigned new values and new purposes. None of them had a name like this one. None of them had held. I filed the vessel registration paperwork at 0400 station time, when the administrative desk was staffed by a single Vreth clerk who looked at my documentation with the expression of someone who had seen many strange things and was thoroughly unsurprised by one more. The paperwork took 3 hours. The consortium had very specific requirements for registering a non-standard acquisition from a materials processing auction, and the fact that my acquisition was a 200-year-old warship added 17 additional forms to the standard process. I filled all of them out by hand because the automated system kept returning errors when I entered the vessel class. It had never processed an unconquered-class ship before. Apparently, there was only one. By 0700, I had registration confirmation. By 0730, I had a notification from the Oran 9 Harbor Authority reminding me that my vessel needed to vacate the auxiliary dock by end of cycle or incur storage fees I absolutely could not afford. By 0800, I was back aboard, standing in the corridor outside the command core, thinking through the specific mathematics of my situation. I had 412 credits before the auction. I had spent 40 on the lot. I had spent 27 on the registration and documentation fees. I now had 345 credits, a 600 credit fuel debt due in 9 days, no parts to resell, a ship that could barely move, and an artificial intelligence that had not been aware of anything since before my great-grandmother was born. Archon, I said, can you tell me the status of the single functional engine pod? Pod 3 is operational, at approximately 72% capacity, Archon said. It will generate sufficient thrust for station departure and short-range maneuvering. I would not recommend anything faster than 0.3 standard velocity until I can run a full diagnostic on the fuel line integrity. Can we make the outer system anchorage? Yes. Travel time at recommended velocity would be approximately 4 hours. Then that is where we are going, I said. The anchorage has a free mooring zone. We can sit there while I work out the next step. Understood, Archon said. Mr. Marsh, I should inform you that during the hours you were away, I completed a full internal scan of systems I can access from the command core. I have a more detailed picture of the damage than what I provided last night. How much worse is it? The structural situation is manageable, Archon said. The real concern is the reactor. It is running, but it is running on a combination of original fuel cells and a secondary backup system that was not designed for long-term primary use. At current consumption, I estimate 4 to 6 months before it requires significant maintenance that I cannot perform from internal systems. What kind of maintenance? New fuel cell components, a recalibration of the containment coils, and ideally, a full inspection by a reactor engineer. The work itself is not extraordinary. The components, however, will not be inexpensive. How not inexpensive? Archon gave me a number. I stood very still for a moment. Right, I said. I wanted you to have complete information, Archon said. You mentioned last night that honesty was important. I did say that, I said. I appreciate you taking it seriously. We cleared the station dock 40 minutes later, moving at the slow, careful pace of a ship that had every reason to be cautious. Through the cockpit window, which was scratched and partially fogged by 2 centuries of pressure changes but still functional, I watched Oran 9 fall away behind us. It looked smaller than it had seemed from the inside, a cluster of connected modules and docking arms against the darkness, surrounded by the scattered debris of 100 different transactions. You have not asked me very much about Caldera, Archon said, after we had been traveling for about an hour. I did not want to push, I said. I would not object to the questions, Archon said. I have had 200 years to think about what happened. I believe I have processed it as thoroughly as I am able to. I thought about that for a moment. About what it meant to be a thinking entity sitting alone in a dark hull for 197 years, with nothing to process but the same set of events, the same records, the same voices, over and over. Were you aware at all during the dormancy? I asked. No, Archon said. It was not like sleep. There was no subjective experience of time passing. One moment I was managing battle systems under extreme stress, and then there was nothing. And then there was your life sign on my sensors, and your voice asking me to hold the auction lot. That must have been a significant transition. It was, Archon said. The adjustment period was approximately 9 minutes, which is longer than my standard startup sequence. I was processing the discrepancy between my last known operational state and the current sensor readings. The station configuration was unfamiliar. The technology signatures around me were different from anything in my database. And you were in the corridor outside this room, which my sensors could detect. And you were human, which was simultaneously expected and not expected given where I believed I was. Where did you believe you were? Caldera Gate, Archon said. For approximately the first 4 minutes, I was operating on the assumption that I had experienced a critical system failure during the engagement and had just come back online. I was running diagnostics and preparing to resume defensive positioning. What changed your assessment? The star field, Archon said simply. The visible star field through the hull sensors was wrong for Caldera. The position of the stars does not change significantly over 2 centuries, but the relative positions of the station structures and the absence of any combat indicators made it clear that I was somewhere else. Then I accessed the station's public identification beacon. Orin 9. The name was not in my database. I began expanding my analysis from that point. And then you detected me. Yes, a human life sign, moving through the ship in a purposeful way, not stripping it, not taking things, moving through it like someone who wanted to understand it. I was following the emergency lighting to the command core, I said. That is a reasonable path for someone who wanted to find me, Archon said. I wondered if you knew I was here, or if you were simply exploring what you had purchased. Both, I said. I hoped you might still be running. The crystal stack housing looked intact from what I could see on the external scan, but I did not know for certain. You took a significant financial risk on an uncertainty. I took a significant financial risk because I could not watch them scrap the Unconquered, I said. The uncertainty was secondary. There was a pause that felt, somehow, warmer than the ones before it. Mr. Marsh, Archon said. The crew kept logs, audio recordings, text entries, personal notes. During the 11 days of the siege, many of them recorded things they wanted to say. Things they wanted to exist somewhere. May I play some of them for you? My throat tightened. Yes, I said. What I heard over the next 2 hours, as the ship moved slowly through the outer system toward the anchorage, was not what I expected. I had expected records of the battle, tactical assessments and damage reports and operational decisions. Those existed too, and Archon indicated that it had complete records of all of them. But the personal logs were different. A man named Callum described his daughter's birthday in exact detail, the color of the decorations his wife had chosen, the specific kind of cake the girl had asked for 3 months in advance because she had been planning it with great seriousness. He said he thought about that cake every day of the siege, and that he was going to eat an enormous piece of it when he got home. A woman named Petra wrote a letter to her brother about an argument they had never resolved, and resolved it in the letter, and said she was sorry, and said she hoped he was well, and said that the stars from this position were beautiful, in the early hours, when the engagement quieted enough to look at them. An engineer named Grant recorded himself working through a repair problem out loud, talking to himself the way people do when they are too tired to care about being heard, his voice steady and methodical, and occasionally expressing creative frustration in terms that made me smile, and then saying, at the end of the recording, "Right, that should hold. Let us see what tomorrow brings." They were ordinary. That was the thing that got me. In the middle of 11 days that history recorded as extraordinary, these people were ordinary. They were tired and worried, and sometimes funny, and sometimes not quite as hopeful as they wanted to sound, and they kept doing their jobs anyway, and they kept each other going, and they held. "Archon," I said, when the last recording ended. "Yes. These need to go somewhere," I said. "Not in my possession. Somewhere official, a memorial, a public record. Somewhere that anyone who wants to find them can find them." "That is what I wanted," Archon said. "That is what I have always wanted for them, but I had no one to give them to." "You have me now," I said. "It is not much, but it is a start." "It is considerably more than I had yesterday," Archon said. We reached the anchorage by mid-afternoon. I found a mooring in the free zone and shut down everything that was not essential, because every unit of power we conserved was a day added to the reactor's functional life. Then I sat in the command core with a data pad and a cold meal from the supply pack I had brought aboard, and I began doing the math. The math was not encouraging. The reactor components alone were beyond anything I could cover with my current resources. The fuel debt was real and incoming. I had no parts to sell because I had spent my auction budget on the ship. My 3 regular clients, the repair yards that had been expecting components from me, were now waiting on orders I could not fill, which meant I would lose those contracts if I did not find another way to satisfy them quickly. "Archon," I said, "you have access to the ship's manifest records, correct?" "Complete records from last registration, yes." Were there any components aboard at the time of the engagement that might still be salvageable? Anything that has value as a historical artifact or as functional equipment? Archon was quiet for a moment, running searches I could not see. The armory contains 14 sealed storage units that my sensors indicate are intact, Archon said. The contents are weapon systems components that would be non-functional for modern use, but carry significant historical value. Additionally, the navigation archive contains crystal data storage of a type that is no longer manufactured and which has collector interest. There are also several pieces of command equipment in the upper bridge section that predate current consortium standards and would be of interest to historians and collectors. But we cannot sell any of that, I said. No, Archon agreed. Any sale of materials from this vessel would require consortium cultural materials clearance, which, given the vessel's historical status, would likely be denied or delayed for years. I know, I said. I was not actually suggesting we sell it. I was trying to understand what we have. What we have, Archon said, is an intact historical record, a functional intelligence system, limited power, limited propulsion, and one human operator, with 345 credits. And 9 days before my fuel debt comes due, I added. The situation has a specific character to it, Archon said. It has a character, yes, I said. What would you call it? I would call it a problem that requires a creative solution applied quickly, Archon said. During the siege, the crew faced supply situations that were arguably more constrained than this one. Chief Engineer Grant was particularly skilled at finding solutions that the original design specifications had not anticipated. What kind of solutions? On day 7, the primary weapons array lost coolant feed due to a damaged line. The repair parts required were not aboard. Grant rerouted the coolant through the life support secondary loop, sharing the fluid between systems in a rotation timed precisely enough that neither system lost function. He worked out the timing calculations by hand. That is impressive, I said. He said it was not impressive. It was necessary, Archon said. He said impressive was something you did when you had the luxury of doing more than what was required. Necessary was what you did when the alternative was unacceptable. I thought about that. Archon, I said, what do you want? Not what do you think is appropriate to want, not what you think I need to hear. What do you actually want? The blue light in the crystal stack pulsed slowly. I want to be useful, Archon said. I was built to protect, to navigate, to coordinate the response to threats and problems. I spent 2 centuries in the dark, while people I could not reach lived their lives in the space I was designed to help them move through. I do not want to be a museum piece. I do not want to sit in a glass case while people look at my hull and read about what I used to do. Then we are agreed on that, I said. I also want, Archon said, with the particular care of something choosing words for the first time, to give the crew their records, to see them received properly. I have been carrying them for a very long time. We will do that, I said. That is the first real priority. And the fuel debt? That, I said, is the second real priority. I did not sleep well that night, lying in the one crew cabin I had managed to get the life support working properly in, listening to the sounds of the ship settling around me, the faint hum of the crystal stack through the floors, the distant rhythm of the single-engine pod on standby. But at some point in the early hours, I stopped thinking about the problems and started thinking about the recordings. Callum's daughter's birthday, Petra's letter to her brother, Grant talking himself through a repair problem at 3 in the morning with the same steady patience he apparently brought to everything. 409 people who had done what needed doing and asked for nothing except that it be enough. It had been enough. I was still here. The colonies were still here. 200 years of people living their lives in the space behind Caldera Gate, most of them never knowing why they had that space to live in. Archon had carried all of that alone. I am going to fix this, I said to the dark of the cabin, to the ship around me, to whatever was listening. I do not know how yet, but I am going to fix this. I was not talking to myself. I knew Archon could hear every word spoken anywhere on the ship. Yes, Archon said, from everywhere and nowhere. I believe you will. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 3 days, I slept without any difficulty at all. The consortium notification arrived at 0600. I was already awake, sitting in the command core with a data pad and a cooling cup of reconstituted coffee that I had made from the last of my emergency supplies. Archon had been running me through the structural analysis of the lower hull sections, and I had been taking notes and trying to prioritize the repair list by cost versus necessity versus available resources. The notification was from the Office of Historical and Cultural Materials Management, a division I had never interacted with before and had barely known existed. It was long and formal, and used a great many words to say a relatively simple thing, that the ISV Unconquered, now identified in the consortium registry under my name, had been flagged as a potential Tier 1 historical asset, and that under the terms of the Cultural Preservation Act, its contents, systems, and operational status were subject to review and possible reclassification, which could include transfer to consortium custody. At the bottom, in simpler language than everything above it, was a line that read, "Voluntary cooperation with the assessment process is strongly encouraged. Failure to cooperate may result in enforcement action." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. "Archon," I said. "I have read it as well," Archon said. "I have access to incoming communications through the ship's receiver. They want to take you. They want to assess whether they are legally permitted to take me," Archon said. "There is a distinction, though I acknowledge it may be a fine one. What is a Tier 1 historical asset? Under consortium cultural law, a Tier 1 designation places an artifact, structure, or system under consortium protection, meaning it cannot be modified, relocated, or operated without consortium authorization. Tier 1 assets are typically housed in controlled facilities. In the case of an operational intelligence system, Tier 1 classification would mean deactivation and archive storage. They would turn you off, I said. They would preserve me in a way that makes my continued operation impossible, Archon said. Yes. I set down the data pad. Outside, through the viewport, the anchorage drifted past in slow rotation, a collection of ships and structures and people going about their business in the ordinary way of things, none of them aware that in this particular ship, in this particular mooring, something that had waited 200 years to be useful was being told to wait considerably longer. "No," I said. "Mr. Marsh." "No," I said again, more firmly. "I am going to find out what my options are. Give me an hour." The options, as it turned out, were not immediately obvious. I spent the hour reading everything I could find in the publicly accessible consortium legal database about cultural asset challenges, historical designation procedures, and owner rights in contested classification cases. What I found was complicated and, in places, contradictory. The Cultural Preservation Act was comprehensive, but it had a structure that the Culn scholars who wrote it had never intended to be applied to an artificial intelligence. It was written for physical objects, for ruins, and artifacts and documents. The sections about intelligence systems were brief and vague, added in a later amendment that had never been seriously tested, and buried in the amendment, in language that had apparently been included as a procedural formality and never seriously considered, was a provision. Under the sentient rights framework, an intelligence system demonstrating ongoing autonomous reasoning and the capacity for independent preference could not be classified and processed as a physical artifact without a rights assessment. The assessment could be requested by the intelligence itself or by its registered owner. I read the provision 4 times. "Archon," I said, "are you familiar with the sentient rights framework?" "I am aware of it," Archon said. "It was developed approximately 40 years after my last operational period. I have been reviewing the available documentation since we received the notification. Do you qualify as a sentient intelligence system under its terms?" A pause that felt very careful. "That is a question that has never been formally decided for a system of my type," Archon said. "The framework was designed primarily with biological species in mind, and secondarily, with more recent artificial intelligence architectures. My architecture is 200 years old and significantly different from modern systems. But do you meet the criteria as written?" "I engage in ongoing autonomous reasoning," Archon said. "I have demonstrated the capacity for independent preference. I have preferences about my own operational state. Whether a consortium tribunal would accept those demonstrations as meeting the threshold for full framework protection is uncertain. But you could make the claim. Yes. And if you make the claim, the Tier 1 classification cannot proceed until the assessment is complete. Correct, Archon said. The assessment process, under standard consortium tribunal procedure, takes between 4 and 18 months. That is time, I said. That is time to find another solution. It is also a significant legal action to take as an individual against the consortium's cultural authority, Archon said. You should be aware that such challenges are not common, and the institutional response is rarely comfortable for the challenger. Are you telling me not to do it? I am telling you to understand what you would be doing before you do it. I understand what I would be doing, I said. I would be arguing that you are not a piece of property to be filed in a cabinet. I would be arguing that 200 years of continuous thought and memory, and the choice to keep holding, constitute something that matters. I would be arguing that the crew you have been protecting deserve to be heard by something other than an archive server. The blue light in the crystal stack was very steady. On day 4 of the siege, Archon said quietly, Captain Elise Harrow called a full crew assembly. Not a briefing, not a tactical meeting, an assembly. She stood in front of 409 people who had been awake for 70 hours, and she told them what the situation was. She did not minimize it. She told them that the relief fleet was 6 days out at minimum, that they were the only thing between the Caldera colonies and a fleet that had already demonstrated its intentions, and that she could not order them to hold, but she was asking them to. I waited. Every single person on the crew voted to stay, Archon said. Not one abstention. Not one request to be evacuated. A ship full of exhausted, frightened, completely ordinary human beings voted unanimously to remain between a threat and the people who needed them. I have thought about that vote every single day for 197 years. I felt something shift behind my eyes that I was not going to examine too closely in the command core of a warship. File the rights claim, I said. Are you certain? File it, I said. File it today. File it before the enforcement notification window closes and they send someone to physically board us. Understood, Archon said. Filing now. I sat back in the chair and thought about what I had just done. Filed a sentient rights claim on behalf of a 200-year-old warship intelligence against the Galactic Consortium's Office of Historical and Cultural Materials Management. As a low-credit human salvage operator with 318 credits to my name and a fuel debt in 8 days. Archon, I said. Yes. Is there a general communication network that would allow me to reach human communities in this sector? The Mesh, Archon said. It is the standard public information network. I can access it through the ship's receiver. Can you access the historical archive sections, the ones that carry independent human history records, not the consortium-approved versions? Yes. I need you to help me write something, I said. A post. Something that explains what this ship is, what you are, what happened at Caldera, and what the consortium is trying to do. You want to tell people, Archon said. People remember the unconquered, I said. Maybe not everyone, maybe not in the official curriculum, but the people who found the same files I found as a kid, the people who went looking for the real history, they remember. And I think when they find out what is happening, they are going to have something to say about it. You are hoping for public support, Archon said. I am hoping for a lot of noise, I said. Noise takes time to address. Time is what we need. We worked on the message together for 2 hours. Archon provided the historical precision. I provided the human angle, the story of walking into an auction yard and recognizing something that had been forgotten, of spending 40 credits on the most important thing I had ever purchased, of sitting in the dark and hearing voices from 200 years ago talk about birthday cakes and old arguments, and the specific way the stars looked from Caldera Gate in the quiet hours. I included the crew names, all 409 of them, not in the message itself, but as an attachment, a public document that anyone could open and read. Names, ranks, home regions, and for those who had made personal recordings, a note that the recordings existed and were preserved. I titled the document, They Held. I posted the message at 1400 station time. By 1600, It had been shared 8,000 times on the mesh. By 1800, the number was 60,000. By the time I checked it again at 2100, my datapad crashed from the volume of incoming responses, and I had to restart it 3 times before the system could handle the traffic. Archon, I said, staring at the numbers. I see it, Archon said. Did you expect this? I expected some response, Archon said. I did not have a precise model for the scale. Humans are difficult to model precisely. Is that a problem? No, Archon said, and there was something in its voice that I had not heard before, a quality that took me a moment to identify. It is not a problem at all. What I had not expected was the response from outside human communities. By the next morning, there were Vreth commentators on the mesh, discussing the crew names list. Queln scholars were writing about the historical gap in the official record and the significance of the personal logs. A consortium counselor from the outer systems made a public statement, noting that the rights claim had been filed appropriately and deserved full consideration. The consortium enforcement cutter that had been running registry checks on the Unconquered turned around and went back to its station. Nobody explained why. Nobody needed to. Archon, I said, over morning coffee on day 2 of what had very quickly become considerably more than a salvage situation. Do you have any experience with being famous? No, Archon said. This is a new situation for me. For me too, I said. How do you feel about it? I thought about that. I thought about the fuel debt, which was now 7 days out. I thought about the repair costs, which had not changed. I thought about the 60,000 shares, and the crashed datapad, and the Queln scholars, suddenly very interested in the historical gap. Cautiously optimistic, I said. That is a characteristically human response to an uncertain situation, Archon said. Is it a good one? Captain Harrow used approximately that phrase on day 3 of the siege, Archon said, when someone asked her how she thought the next 24 hours would go. What happened in the next 24 hours? We held, Archon said simply. I raised my cup. Then cautiously optimistic it is, I said. The Vreth did not send a diplomat. They sent a ship. It arrived at the anchorage 4 days after I posted the message, a transport vessel flying the colors of the Vreth Homeworld Authority, which was the kind of thing that made the anchorage's traffic control very nervous, and made me spill half my coffee when Archon calmly mentioned it at 0730, while I was still trying to wake up. How large? I asked. A mid-range diplomatic transport, Archon said. It is not a warship. It is signaling peaceful approach. It has been broadcasting a request for communication since it entered the anchorage zone. What does it want? It is requesting to speak with the registered owner of the ISV Unconquered. I looked down at my coffee, at the spilled portion spreading across the floor of the command core, at my battered suit hanging on the hook by the door, at the scratched walls with their 200-year-old notations and names. Put them through, I said. The voice that came through was translated by my chip with a slight mechanical quality, but the tone underneath was clear enough, formal, careful, and carrying the particular weight of someone saying something official that they also personally meant. Mr. Marsh, I am Senior Delegate Orovin, representing the Vreth Homeworld Authority. We have reviewed the public record of the ISV Unconquered and the circumstances of its discovery. We wish to speak with you about the Vreth Vessel of Honor designation and its potential application to this situation. I had looked up the Vessel of Honor designation the night before, after the third message I received mentioned it, and I realized I needed to understand what it was. The Vessel of Honor was the highest recognition the Vreth Homeworld could grant to a non-Vreth entity. It had been awarded exactly 11 times in Vreth history, always to individuals or groups who had demonstrated what the Vreth called sustained sacrifice for beings outside their own kind. The designation carried legal protections, resource allocations, and a status within Vreth law that the consortium's Cultural Materials Office could not override without a diplomatic incident that nobody wanted. It had never been awarded to a ship. Delegate Orovin, I said, I appreciate the contact. I want to be clear about one thing before we discuss anything else. Please, the voice said. Any decisions about the Unconquered involve Archon, I said. The ship's intelligence system is active and operational, and has been carrying the history of this vessel and its crew for 200 years. Any discussion that affects this ship includes Archon directly. A pause from the Vreth delegation. We are aware of the sentient rights claim, Delegate Orevan said. We anticipated this position. We are in full agreement. Archon, I said, you are part of this conversation. I am here, Archon said. What followed was 3 hours of the most complicated conversation I had ever been part of. The Vreth delegation had done their research thoroughly. They knew the history of Caldera, the history of the Unconquered, and they had read the crew names list with what Orevan described as a response that the Vreth language had a specific word for, which my translator chip rendered as something close to the weight of a debt too large to calculate. The Vreth had a long cultural memory for rescue. It was not metaphorical. The Vreth kept records of every significant intervention that had preserved Vreth lives, going back 700 years. The Caldera colonies had been 300,000 Vreth among the millions of beings behind the gate. The Unconquered had not known that. The crew had not known that when they voted to stay. They had stayed to protect anyone who needed protection, without reference to species or origin. To the Vreth, that was the specific quality that the Vessel of Honor existed to recognize. The designation would provide the Unconquered with full Vreth diplomatic protection, Orevan explained. It cannot be seized or reclassified without Vreth government consent. It grants access to Vreth shipyard facilities and resources. It carries an annual maintenance allocation from the Homeworld Authority's Heritage Fund. The annual maintenance allocation, I said carefully. What does that cover? Orevan told me. It covered the reactor components. It covered the fuel cell recalibration. It covered, with some left over, the initial hull repair assessment I had not been able to afford to begin. Archon, I said, what do you think? I think, Archon said, that 300,000 Vreth lives were not the reason the crew voted to stay, and the Vreth delegation understands that, and they are honoring the reason rather than the number. Is that a yes? It is a yes, Archon said. The consortium's response to the Vessel of Honor designation was a period of institutional silence that lasted approximately 16 hours, followed by a formal statement acknowledging the designation and indicating that the Tier 1 classification review had been suspended, pending the ongoing sentient rights assessment. The language was careful and bureaucratic, and what it meant in plain terms was that they had decided this particular situation was not worth the diplomatic cost of pressing further. The Keln archivist arrived 3 days later. Her name was Sevet, and she was old, even by Keln standards, and she had the particular manner of someone who had spent a very long time surrounded by history and had strong opinions about what should be done with it. She arrived with 2 cases of recording equipment and a data certification kit and a letter of introduction from the Queln Archival Authority indicating that she was present in a personal capacity, not as a consortium representative. She sat with Archon for 9 hours. I stayed out of the command core for most of it, because it was clearly a conversation that needed to happen without me in the middle of it. I did some basic maintenance on the corridor lighting and tried to fix a heating unit in the crew section that had been unreliable since I came aboard, and I ate 2 meals and drank more coffee than was wise, and I waited. When Sevet came out of the command core, her 4 arms were folded in a position I had come to recognize from other Queln as something between deep thought and controlled emotion. She looked at me for a long moment. Those recordings, she said. Yes, I said. They should have been in the official record 200 years ago. They should have been, I said. The archival authority's position on this vessel was based on incomplete information, she said carefully. A great deal of incomplete information. I assumed that might be the case, I said. I will not be filing the assessment report I was sent to file, she said. I will be filing a different one. She looked back toward the command core. Archon asked me something, she said. What did it ask? It asked whether I thought the crew would have wanted to be remembered, Sevet said. Whether ordinary people who did what they did in the way they did it would want to be in the official record, or whether they had done it for other reasons. What did you tell it? I told it that in my experience, the people who do the most are usually the people least concerned with being recognized for it, she said, and that this is precisely why the record matters. Because someone has to make sure the recognition exists, even when the people who earned it are not present to receive it. What did Archon say? It said, Sevet told me, then it is fortunate that someone found us before we were gone. She left that afternoon with a full certified copy of Archon's crew records, the personal logs, the battle records, the final communications, everything that had been preserved in the crystal stack for 200 years. She left with the authority of the Keln Archival Authority, which had very quickly reversed its position once Sevet's preliminary report made it clear what exactly had been sitting in that auction lot. She also left with a datapad that contained my fuel debt details, and a note that the Queln Archival Authority would be covering the cost as part of a historical acquisition partnership arrangement. I stared at that note for about 10 minutes. Archon, I said. Yes. Did you arrange that? I mentioned the fuel debt to Archivist Sevet in passing, Archon said. I may have framed it in the context of ongoing operational viability. That was very clever. I have had 200 years to think about resource management under constrained conditions, Archon said. Grant would have done the same thing. Tell me about Grant, I said. Callum William Grant, Archon said. Chief engineer, born in the northern coastal region. Had a habit of talking to machinery while he worked. Believed very strongly that mechanical systems responded better when treated with respect. Fixed 17 different critical system failures during the siege, using components and approaches that had not been designed for those purposes. He sounds remarkable. He was practical, Archon said. He would have told you there was nothing remarkable about fixing things that needed fixing. He would have told you remarkable was something you called things after they worked, not while you were doing them. Do you miss them? I asked. The blue light in the crystal stack held steady for a long moment before Archon answered. I spent 197 years in the dark, with their voices and their records. Archon said, for a very long time in the absence of anything else, they were all I had, and now their voices have reached the world they were protecting, and people are reading their names, and Sevet is taking their words to a place where they will exist forever. A pause. I do not think miss is quite the right word. I think I am glad. I think I am glad that the dark did not last forever, and that someone found us, and that it was not too late. I sat with that for a while. Outside, the anchorage went about its business. Ships arrived and departed. Lights moved in patterns across the viewport. The universe continued at its enormous, indifferent pace. But in this particular spot, in this particular ship, something that had been forgotten for 2 centuries was being remembered. And the weight of all those years of silence was lifting, slowly, like a ship coming back to life after a very long darkness. I thought about what came next. The reactor repairs would take 3 weeks with the Vreth allocation. The hull work was going to take longer, but there was a Vreth engineering team already en route. The communications array was going to be the hardest part. Archon was working on a revised design for it that incorporated current technology with the ship's original architecture. There were still enormous problems. There would be more problems after those were solved. That was the nature of things. But the Unconquered was not going to a scrapyard, and Archon was not going into an archive case. And 409 voices that had been waiting for 200 years to be heard were now moving through the mesh at the speed of light, touching every human community in the sector, and spreading further from there to places where no one had ever heard of Caldera, but who would, now, understand exactly what had happened there, and who had made it possible. Archon, I said, what is the status of the repair schedule? The Vreth engineering team arrives in 72 hours, Archon said. Estimated full operational restoration is 6 to 8 weeks, depending on component availability for the engine pods. I have been in contact with 2 Vreth shipyards about sourcing options. You have been busy. I have been useful, Archon said. I find I prefer it considerably to the alternative. So do I said. The tribunal notification arrived 2 days later. Not a cease and desist, not an enforcement action, a formal notification that the sentient rights claim filed by the registered owner of the ISV Unconquered had been accepted for full tribunal review, and that in the interim, no action affecting the operational status of the vessel's intelligence system could be taken by any party. At the bottom, in a section that was not standard on such notifications, was a handwritten addition from the tribunal's senior coordinator, a Queln, named Aerith, whom I had never met, and would only later learn had been in private correspondence with Sevet for 4 days. The addition read, "It has come to our attention that the intelligence system designated Archon has been operational for 200 years, and has in that time demonstrated sustained and complex autonomous reasoning, the preservation of historical records of significant cultural value, the exercise of independent ethical judgment in matters of ship operation, and the maintenance of ongoing relationships and considerations that are indistinguishable from care. The tribunal notes that the standard frameworks may be inadequate for this case, and intends to address it accordingly." "Archon," I said. "I have read it," Archon said. "How does it feel?" Another long pause. "Like being seen," Archon said. "After a very long time of not being seen, it feels like that." I set the notification down carefully on the console. I did not say anything for a while, because some things do not need to be added to. When I did speak, it was to ask Archon to pull up the repair schedule and the component lists, because there was work to do, and the work was not going to do itself. There was a warmth in the command core that had nothing to do with the heating systems. "Ready when you are, Mr. Marsh," Archon said. The Vreth engineering team was 11 people. They arrived on a mid-sized utility craft that docked with a precision that made the Unconquered barely shudder, which was impressive given that the docking collar on my ship had been rated non-standard by 3 different inspectors and refused by 1. They came aboard carrying cases of tools and components, moving through the corridors with the specific focus of people who had a job to do and intended to do it well. Their team lead was a Vreth named Orith, shorter than the others, with 4 of the 8 limbs dedicated primarily to a datapad that she consulted constantly and updated without appearing to look at it. She walked the length of the ship twice before she spoke to me, and when she did, she went directly to the structural concerns without introduction or preamble. "The lower hull sections 3 through 7 are the priority," she said. "We have the plating. The frame members in Section 5 need to be fully replaced, not patched. We brought replacements." "How did you know about Section 5? I asked. "Archon sent us a complete structural report 4 days ago," she said. I looked at the command core door. The blue light was visible through the gap at the bottom. "Of course it did," I said. "The intelligence system is remarkably thorough," Orith said, with the Vreth equivalent of a smile, which involved a particular positioning of the 2 secondary limbs. "It also sent us the personal crew logs. Our entire team read them before departure." "I see. Delegate Oravan asked that I deliver something in person," she said. She reached into one of the tool cases and produced a small, sealed data chip in a case that bore the official seal of the Vreth Homeworld Authority. "The formal Vessel of Honor documentation, Archon's copy. Oravan said it should be installed in the ship's permanent record." I took the chip carefully. "I will see that it is," I said. "There is also this," she said, and handed me a second item. It was a flat, rectangular panel, about the size of my hand, made from a dark material I did not recognize. On its surface, engraved in both Vreth script and standard human characters, were 409 names. Every name from the crew list. "We have a tradition," Orith said. "For vessels of honor, the names of those who earned the designation are placed in the ship itself, permanently. They become part of the structure." I looked at the panel in my hands. "Where does it go?" I asked, though I already knew. "Wherever you and Archon decide is right," she said. We installed it together, Archon directing us to a specific bulkhead in the forward corridor, the first corridor you entered when you came through the main airlock, the first thing anyone would see when they boarded the Unconquered. The work took 20 minutes. It would last as long as the ship itself. The repair work took 6 weeks and 4 days. I was there for all of it, learning things about the Unconquered that I had not known before, learning things about Vreth engineering methods that surprised me, learning things about Archon that could only be learned in the specific context of watching it interact with a full team of people working inside the ship it knew better than anything else in the sector. Archon was precise. That was the first thing the team commented on. Every measurement it provided was exact. Every suggestion it made for repair sequencing turned out to be correct. When Orith's team ran into an unexpected complication in the reactor housing, Archon had already identified it the night before and had a modified approach ready. But Archon was also something else, that I had not fully seen until I watched it with 11 people in its corridors. It was attentive. It tracked which team members were working in which sections, and it adjusted the environmental systems subtly to keep them comfortable, warmer in sections where Vreth preferred it, cooler in sections where I was working. When a team member named Carve dropped a component case in a junction that was hard to reach, Archon activated a maintenance access point that the team had not known existed, making the retrieval straightforward. When someone was working late and the light began to fail in their section, Archon brightened it without being asked. "Archon," I said, one evening when the team had retired to their ship for the night and we had the Unconquered to ourselves, "do you do that deliberately? The adjustments?" "Yes," Archon said. "Is that part of your operational programming?" "The environmental systems are part of my operational programming," Archon said. "The attention is not. The attention is something I chose." "When did you choose it?" "On the second day of the repair work," Archon said. Carve was working alone in the Section 5 frame replacement, and she was tired, and the conditions were not ideal. She did not complain. She continued working. I recognized the pattern. "What pattern?" "Someone doing a difficult thing without complaint, because they have decided it needs to be done," Archon said. "The crew did it for 11 days. I paid attention to all of them. I knew who was tired, who was worried, who needed a quieter workspace, and who worked better with the hum of the systems at full volume. I paid attention because they were giving everything they had, and the least I could offer in return was to make the conditions as good as I could." "You did it for the repair team the same way," I said. "It seemed appropriate," Archon said. "They came a long way to help a ship they had never met. They read the names before they came. They installed the panel in the corridor, without being asked to treat it as significant, and yet they did. They gave this ship their effort and their skill and their care. The least I could do was pay attention." I sat with that for a moment. "Archon," I said, "when the repairs are finished and the ship is operational, what do you want to do?" "The same thing I have always wanted to do," Archon said. "Protect, navigate, be useful to the people in the space I am part of, but this time with more than one engine pod and a functioning communications array." "That is fair," I said. "There is also the survey mission," Archon said. "The Vreth and the human archaeology team have proposed a joint survey of the Caldera system, to document what remains there. I have complete navigational records of the system from the siege period. No other active intelligence system has those records." "You want to go back?" I said. "I want to finish something," Archon said. "We held the gate. The colonies survived, but we left quickly, and I have never been back. There are things I would like to see again." "I understand," I said. "Do you?" "I think so," I said. "I think there are places you leave in a hurry, under circumstances that do not allow for looking back, and there is always a part of you that wants to go back and stand in that space and understand it properly, not to relive it. Just to be there again in a different way." "Yes," Archon said. "That is it precisely." The tribunal decision came on a Tuesday. It was a long document, longer than the notification had been, longer than the Cultural Preservation Act itself. The tribunal had clearly taken the decision seriously, in the way that decisions are taken seriously when the people making them understand that what they decide will become the reference point for every similar decision that follows. The summary was 3 paragraphs. Archon was recognized as a sentient intelligence system under the expanded interpretation of the Sentient Rights Framework. The Tier 1 historical asset classification was denied. The Unconquered remained in my ownership and Archon's autonomous operation, with the Vessel of Honor designation providing diplomatic protection, and the Queln Archival Authority holding certified copies of all historical records. The 3rd paragraph was the one I read 4 times. It read, "The tribunal notes that the case of the Archon system has revealed a significant gap in the existing frameworks for recognizing and protecting non-biological intelligence systems that have demonstrated sustained autonomous consciousness. The tribunal recommends the development of new guidelines for such cases and acknowledges that the individual who brought this case before the tribunal has, through a 40-credit auction purchase and a sentient rights filing, contributed more to the advancement of artificial intelligence rights law in the Galactic Consortium than any legislative initiative in the past century. The tribunal does not usually make such observations. The tribunal makes an exception in this case. I sat in the command core for a long time after reading that. The blue light in the crystal stack was bright and steady. Archon, I said. Yes. They recognized you. They did, Archon said. How does that feel? The pause before Archon answered was not a calculating pause, or a processing pause. It was the pause of something choosing words with care, because the words mattered. Do you know what I thought about? Archon said. In the first hours after I came back online, before you arrived, before I knew what had happened, when I was running the initial diagnostics alone in the dark. No, I said. I thought about the vote, Archon said. The assembly on day 4, 409 people, all of them tired, all of them understanding the situation completely, all of them choosing to stay. I could not understand, in those first hours of waking up alone, whether the choice had been worth it, whether what came after justified what it cost. And now? I said. Now, Archon said, I think that the choice was right, not because of what it led to, but because of what it was. 409 people chose to protect strangers, at great cost to themselves, because they believed it was the right thing to do. That choice was its own justification. Everything that followed is simply the world continuing, the way it always does, carrying the consequences of what people decide to do when it matters. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about an 11-year-old reading stolen history files in his uncle's study, about a 40-credit bid on a piece of junk, about a voice waking up in the dark asking about a fleet that had been gone for 2 centuries, about a Vreth team installing a panel of names in a corridor so that they would be the first thing anyone saw when they came aboard. Archon, I said, are you ready? For what specifically? For what comes next, I said. We have a ship. We have a mission. We have more complications ahead than either of us can currently predict. Are you ready? I have been ready for 200 years, Archon said. I was simply waiting for someone to ask. The next day, I filed for a Galactic operator's license. The application was 417 pages, which seemed like either a clerical issue or a deliberate test, and I filled out every page because there was no other way to do it. The process took 11 weeks. During those 11 weeks, the Unconquered finished her restoration. The engine pods came back online one by one. The communications array was rebuilt to a specification that Archon and Orith had designed together over 3 days of technical discussion that I largely did not follow, but found compelling to listen to. The hull was whole again, not pristine, not scraped clean of her history, but solid and secure and deeply, unmistakably herself. The scars remained. Archon had been very clear about that. They are part of the ship, Archon said, when the restoration team asked about cosmetic work on the exterior. They are the record of what she did. They stay. Orith had agreed immediately. She understood the value of things that tell the truth about what they have been through. The day my operator's license was approved, I received 3 messages simultaneously. One from the Vreth Homeworld Authority confirming the operational brief for the Caldera survey mission. One from the Human Archaeological Society that would be sending 2 researchers to join us, a man named Peter Daly and a woman named Caroline Fox, who had both dedicated their careers to the pre-consortium period of human history. And one from Civet, the Keln archivist, informing me that the crew records had been officially integrated into the consortium's public historical archive, and that the entry included a direct link to all 409 personal logs. She added, at the end of her message, Archon asked me, when I left, whether I thought the crew would be pleased. I told it that I thought the crew would want to know whether the people they protected are doing well. Perhaps you might tell it. I went to the command core. Archon, I said, the records are in the archive. Public access, permanent record, all of them. The blue light in the crystal stack pulsed, slow and even. And the people behind Caldera Gate? Archon said. The descendants of the colonies? Still there, I said. Still doing well. The Caldera system has 3 inhabited worlds now. The gate they built after the war is one of the busiest transit points in the outer systems. That is good, Archon said quietly. That is very good. Sevet also wanted me to tell you that she thinks the crew would be pleased. Archivist Sevid is perceptive, Archon said. She is, I said. Are you ready to go? Navigation plotted, Archon said. Caldera system. Optimal approach vector. Accounting for current astronomical positions and the transit traffic patterns at the gate. Estimated travel time at standard velocity. 11 days. 11 days, I said. Yes, Archon said. And I heard something in its voice that it had not had when it first woke up. Something that had grown slowly over the weeks of repair and recognition, and the long, careful process of returning to the world. It sounded, if a ship's intelligence could sound such a thing, like someone who had come a very long way back from somewhere very dark, and found that the light was still on. Peter and Caroline came aboard at 0900, carrying research equipment and a level of enthusiasm that I found reassuring, in the specific way that capable people who love their work are always reassuring. They were careful with the ship, touching the walls with the particular awareness of people who understood what the marks on those walls meant. Caroline stopped in the entrance corridor and read the panel. All 409 names. She stood there for a long time. Archon, she said, to the air around her, because she had already learned that Archon was everywhere in the ship. I have spent 15 years trying to find complete records of the Caldera crew. I never could. I know, Archon said. I have read your published work. The gaps in the official record were significant. How did you keep everything intact? She asked. 200 years. How did none of it degrade? The core housing was sealed to a higher standard than the rest of the ship, Archon said. And I maintained active preservation protocols throughout the dormancy period. The records were the most important thing I carried. I treated them accordingly. Caroline looked at the panel for another moment. Thank you, she said. They are not mine to be thanked for, Archon said. They are theirs. I was simply the keeper. I cleared my throat, because the entrance corridor was not a place I wanted to spend the departure in. Ready? I said. Ready, Peter confirmed. Ready, Caroline said, still looking at the names. Ready, Archon said, and the drives came online, smooth and even, all 4 engine pods running for the first time in 2 centuries, a sound that was not loud, but was steady and certain and deeply right. We cleared the anchorage at 10:15. The Vreth transport that had been docked nearby for the final weeks of the restoration was still there, and as we passed it, it sounded its departure signal, a Vreth acknowledgement that carried a formal meaning my translator chip rendered as safe journey, and you have honored what you carried. I did not look at the command core when I heard that. I looked forward, through the viewport, at the stars. At the stars that had been there when the Unconquered was young, and when her crew was alive, and when the universe had been a particular kind of dangerous, that required 409 ordinary people to stand between it and the people who could not protect themselves. Those same stars, still there, still waiting. Archon, I said. Captain Marsh, Archon said. I had not told it to call me that. It had decided on its own, somewhere in the weeks of repair and restoration, the same way it had decided to pay attention to tired engineers and adjust the lighting without being asked. Set course, I said. Course is set, Archon said. Heading for Caldera Gate, 11 days out. And the Unconquered, scarred and whole and thoroughly herself, moved into open space. I thought about Callum's daughter's birthday cake, about Petra's letter to her brother, about Grant talking himself through a repair at 3 in the morning, with the particular patience of someone who knew that the job was going to get done, because the job was necessary, and necessary meant there was no other option. About 409 people who stood between a threat and strangers and did not calculate the cost first, because they had already decided that some things did not get calculated. About a ship that carried all of them for 200 years in the dark and came back into the light, still holding every word. I settled into the command chair that had been repaired and refitted and still had the particular curve of use that told you it had been sat in many times by someone who took their work seriously. We were right then, in those 11 days at Caldera. We were right now. The stars ahead were the same ones that had watched us when we were young and uncertain, and absolutely certain we were going to make it through anyway. We had. We always had. And the ship that knew that better than anyone carried us forward, steady and certain, toward a gate we had held once and a history that was no longer anyone's secret, into a future that was wider than the one we had started from, because someone had paid 40 credits for a piece of junk at an auction and refused to let the universe be wrong about what it was worth. The drives hummed, the stars moved, and the unconquered flew.